Well, Darwin was born in 1809, which many people will realise, of course, because 2009 was the 200th anniversary of his birth. And he's born into a comfortable Anglican or Anglican water professional family. His father and grandfather were both doctors, and he is expected to be a doctor. His father was probably an atheist. That's sort of implicit in some of the information we have. It was never explicit, but he's not religiously orthodox. His grandfather, both his maternal and paternal grandfathers, one of them was Erasmus Darwin, who was the most famous evolutionist of the 18th century. The other was JOSIAH Wedgwood, who was a Unitarian. So along both paternal and maternal family lines, there's a kind of heterodox beliefs there. They're really on the periphery of Christian orthodoxy. And even though his mother appears to have been a reasonably orthodox believer, his mother died when Darwin was aged 8, and there didn't seem to be a great deal of anything more than a very sort of superficial Christian upbringing. He went to school, he attended the chapel at school, but it's not particularly deep felt. The other important element is this scientific strand that goes into his upbringing. He's expected to be a doctor. Indeed, he goes to train for a couple of years in Edinburgh with his older brother Erasmus to be a doctor. He never had the heart for it. He recounts fleeing from an operating theatre when he witnessed a couple of operations that were botched, particularly one on a child, and he said nothing could have possibly persuaded me to go back in there. And after a couple of years or so, he realised that there was no way he could be a doctor, and he did like hunting quite a bit, like shooting animals quite a bit, so he wasn't too squeamish. And his father once had a go at him when he was about 18 years old about the fact that he was simply becoming an idle sporting man, and like many fathers the world over talking to sort of late teenagers, why don't you pull your act together and actually do something with your life? The thing he decided to do with his life was to join the church, which may be a surprising thing to hear given the fact that his Christian faith was superficial. I mean, it was real, but it was pretty superficial. But this goes back to the element of the stratum in society he was from. He's from a comfortable, educated, literate, professional background, which is really the kind of the pillar of the society at Shrewsbury, where he was born and brought up. And so going into the church was a natural thing to do. He wasn't entirely sure about it, and he felt he had to sort of step back a little bit and actually think about what he did believe. So he went away for a summer and read some very long, extremely turgid tomes of Christian theology and persuaded himself that he did more or less believe what they said. So he agreed. So in his background, his personal background, there's a scientific element which focuses his mind on the collection of evidence. There's a kind of formalised Christianity, which isn't particularly heartfelt, but is there nonetheless. And then there's a slightly broader background, which is, at the time, the intellectual culture in which he is growing up. This is the 1810s and 1820s. Christian theology in this country is heavily influenced by natural theology, and particularly by people like William Paley, who was enormously influential at the time. And natural theology argues that one of the best ways, probably the best way of getting to God, as it were, not literally in terms of salvation, but getting to understand God, is by studying the natural world. Natural theology emerges from, in a sense, the ruins of the 30 Years' War and the religious conflict of the 17th century, when church tradition and scripture seem to be two contentious issues to actually base your faith on. The natural world seems to be a lot less contentious, and it's open to everybody, so that becomes the basis of theology. And that was the basis of a lot of the Anglican theology that Darwin was brought up in. So it's those elements, really. Being an ordinand in Cambridge wasn't necessarily the most onerous thing that Darwin could have done at that particular age. As I said, he went into it largely because he felt that he was singularly ill-suited to medicine, and his father acquiesced to him becoming a clergyman, although I think he probably would have preferred had he become a doctor as he was. Darwin went up to Cambridge, and at Cambridge at the time, William Paley, the natural theologian, is a dominant figure. Several of his texts, which are already at that stage 30 or 40 years old, are compulsory reading for ordinands, and Darwin gets to grips with them and is entertained and persuaded by them. But the one thing by William Paley that isn't a set text is also the one thing that Darwin most is inspired by, and that's his book Natural Theology, which was published about 20 or so years before Darwin went up to Cambridge. Right at the beginning of the 19th century it was published, and it argues in very considerable detail that you can read the existence and something of the nature of God off the natural world. So it's the familiar argument from design, but the Newtonian argument from design that was more popular at the beginning of the 18th century, the idea that you could infer God's existence and nature from the design of the cosmos, has been replaced largely in William Paley's natural theology by the idea that you can know something of the existence and nature of God through looking at the natural world, through looking at the design of plants, the design of animals, and of course the design of human beings. And Darwin is entranced by this and persuaded, and it is, if you like, the high point of his Christian life. This is the time in which he is most sincerely committed to the Christian faith, and it is this period when he would be considered, most likely consider himself to be an orthodox Christian. But it's an orthodox of a particular type, and it's worth emphasising a little later on when he is travelling around South America as part of his Beagle voyage. He visits a lot of Catholic churches to look at the art, and he's very impressed by it. And at one point he mentioned to some Catholic senoritas, as he describes them, that he happened to do this church going, this visiting for aesthetic reasons, and they're horrified. The idea of someone going into church just for aesthetic reasons is pretty appalling as far as they're concerned. And they ask him, you know, is he not a Christian? And he responds to them, and he recounts this in The Voyage of the Beagle by saying that he was a sort of Christian, by which, of course, in the context he means an Anglican sort of Christian. And indeed, he was an Anglican sort of Christian, but it's even more particular than that. He's a particular sort of Anglican sort of Christian. And the sort of Anglican sort of Christian he is one whose theology is based on natural theology. So, although, of course, he knows the New Testament, he knows Greek, that's part of becoming an ordinand, and he studies the 39 Articles, and he studies the creeds, and so on and so forth, it is really natural theology that undergirds his own Christian beliefs. And it's that really sustains his Christianity. It sustains it all the way through his time at Cambridge, although, of course, famously, he doesn't get ordained in the end. The opportunity to travel around the world on the Beagle comes up in his last year at Cambridge, and he seizes it with both hands, which is an indication, quite apart from anything else, of the fact that even though this was his high point of his Christian life, he's still primarily a naturalist. Actually, he's primarily a geologist at this point. It's geology that most excites him, and it's geology that really is the prime attraction of going on the Beagle. It's not only geology, but it's primarily geology. So even though he is most Christian, if I could put it that way, at this point in life, he is still rather more a scientist. Darwin spends a little over 4 years on the Beagle. It's the period of his life that he considers himself to be most orthodox as a Christian believer, and at one point he recounts, I think it's in his journal of his time on the Beagle, that he engaged in a debate with a few members of the crew and cited the Bible as the unarguable source of authority that would seal this argument, would decide this argument, and he's laughed at by a number of the other crew members. It's a nice little vignette of how at that particular time in Darwin's life